Mike Clifford here, and I'm going to show you how I made this modular wall garden out of a single sheet of plywood. It has LED white lighting to light your desk or entryway. It has LED plant grow lights. It has a shelf, and it also has modular planters that double as cubby holes. Basically, the idea with this was to make the entire piece out of stacked plywood. So the only thing you'd see of the plywood was the edge banding. I like this challenge because it's the part of the plywood that most people try to cover up, but I actually think it looks the best. Now, most of this build involved a lot of cutting strips, cutting squares, and then gluing. I'm not going to really go into a lot of detail about how that's done because you can watch just about any woodworking video on the entire internet and find out how to use saws and glue. Each planter was made from a 4.5 inch cube of stacked plywood. I first glued up all the pieces for a cube except for the bottom piece because I use a hole saw to drill through 5 of the pieces making up the cube, and then would put a solid piece on to form the bottom of the planter, which you'll see that process right here. To accomplish this, my hole saw was only 2 inches deep, so I had to come from the top, flip it over, and then come from the bottom. And if they weren't perfectly lined up, then I used a hammer to knock out the cylindrical core. Cube planters just fit in my 12-inch miter saw, and so that made it very easy to just use the miter saw to level off the sides of all the planters. Coming from the top and the bottom with the hole saw, left some jagged edges in the middle where it didn't quite line up, so I used a drum sander on my drill press to clean that up. And then I was finished with 8 planters, of which I actually only used 7. Now, I was kind of designing this as I went, and when I looked at the straight edges, they just didn't quite look right, so I took the cubes over to the router table and I used a round over bit just to round off the edges. And then it was on to repeat the process of stacking and gluing for the 4.5 inch by 28 inch shelf and the long 3 inch by 5 inch rectangle that would hold the LED lights. Now, I thought about using a planer to get the shelf piece and the lighting piece squared and level, but I'd heard some horror stories about putting edge banding and plywood through a planer, so I decided to just use a table saw to even out the edges, and it wasn't perfect, but it worked pretty darn well. I set my table saw at 60 degrees and cut an angle out of the 3 inch by 5 inch block so that the lights for your desk or your room would be angled outward away from the wall garden. Then used a router and I cut in channels for the LED strips. Now, I used an LED channel, which you see me cutting here, which fits really nicely into a 3/4 inch channel and is a really nice, easy way to put clean looking LEDs into any kind of woodworking project. Just cutting a 3/4 inch channel and gluing this aluminum profile directly in. So I'll leave a link for that in the video description. It's also fairly inexpensive. I then went over and I routed out a tray for the top of the shelf, which will also probably end up serving as a drip tray if any of the planters have leakage. started looking at how everything was going to be laid out, I realized that the original 24 by 30 inch sheet that I cut to service the backboard for everything wasn't going to be big enough. So I used my Kreg jig and some pocket holes to extend the backboard by 3 inches. I think this is a good example of why, if you're the type of person like me that just doesn't really work with plans, it's okay. If you just design as you build and start out with a rough idea in your head, I think you sometimes end up with some really cool things that you wouldn't get if you're constrained by your original plans. I decided to use a 1.5 inch bottom cleaning router bit to basically carve out the interior of the shelf that would be at the bottom of the wall planter. This made an absolutely unbelievable amount of dust. Now, this bottom cleaning bit has been a really cool tool to have. It can remove a lot of material really quickly and easily, and I also used it to flatten a slab. I'll put a link to it in the description if anyone's interested. Again, I used some water locks to finish off the plywood and really make the ingrains pop out and the contrast show. After letting the water locks cure fully, I went back and used some polyacrylic on the interior of each planter because it was going to be exposed to moisture, and so I wanted to really have a good polyacrylic finish inside there. And then it was time to start laying out the planter and attaching everything. To make each planter modular, I used magnets on 2 sides so that you could flip it 90 degrees and have it function as a cubby hole and as a planter when rotated 90 degrees upwards. I just used 4 magnets and fuse it, which I really like as a sort of miracle adhesive. It just holds everything to attach the magnets. And then I also attached magnets to matching locations on the backer piece of plywood. Now, again, with the designing as I go theme, I decided after looking at the shelf that I really didn't like the square edges against the round edges of the shelf, and that I needed to round over the base edges and use a router to round over the edges of the backboard. I also used the bottom cleaning bit again to route out a channel where I would have a thin piece of wood that I could attach the on-off toggle switches, and also a recessed channel where I could put electronics and have them further spaced from the wall so they wouldn't have hot components right against the wall. After putting all the wood parts together, it was time for electronics. First, wired in these really cool sort of retro on-off toggle switches, and I'll have a link for those in the description if you like them. And use the LET channel with some CA glue and use the adhesive backing of some white LEDs. In this case, they were color changing, and they actually do some cool chasing patterns in the main channel, and then used LED plant grow lights and put them in the recessed channel to give the plants what they need. Now, once again, I greatly overcomplicated the electronics by trying to use a 5-volt strip and a 12-volt strip and having them run from the same power supply. You can follow along with the text while I'm doing this if you're really interested. Otherwise, just get 2 12-volt LED strips and use those and follow the directions that come with it, because that will be much easier and won't require all of this fairly complicated wiring that you see here. After wiring everything up, it was time to hang it on the wall using the French cleat system like I've shown in some of my last videos. Watch those if you're interested. And after hanging, it was time to turn it on and add some plants. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please click that subscribe button below and you can be notified about all my future builds, and it helps me out. This is sort of a different project, but I thought it was pretty fun and I hope you liked it. That's all for this time. I'll see you next time when we get back to some concrete fun.